Hello everyone, my name is Wana Burcu and I'm a researcher at the Rights Lab, a leading center of research focused on modern slavery, based here at the University of Nottingham in the UK. I would like to first say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this great lineup of presenters and also to give me the opportunity to talk to you today about one of my latest projects focused on labor exploitation. The project is entitled Reducing the Risks of Exploitation for Vulnerable Migrant Workers in the UK and has been jointly produced with my colleague Dr. Alison Gardner and Charlotte Gray. The project has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and by the Modern Slavery Policy Evidence Centre. What we're really interested to do through this study was to run an exploratory research into the risks and challenges that COVID brought for migrant workers in the UK. In order to do this, we had to break down the question into multiple sub-questions. We therefore looked at the problems that migrant workers generally experience at their workplace and the particular problems that they experienced during COVID. We also wanted to get a better understanding of workers' knowledge about their labor rights under the UK law. But also, what are the main barriers that they encounter to reporting labor abuse? And perhaps more importantly, how can workers be empowered to stand up for their rights? We had a particular interest in Romanian and Bulgarian workers, and this is justified on two bases. On the one hand, Romanian and Bulgarian are in top 3 EU nationalities that are referred in the NRM. The NRM stands for the National Referral Mechanism, which is the system in the UK through which suspected victims of modern slavery are referred into the national system. We also knew that most of these people are referred in the NRM due to labor exploitation issues. Moreover, Romanian and Bulgarians also constitute a large percentage of the agri-food British workforce. Therefore, it made sense for us to focus only on this particular population as a springboard to a potentially larger project later on that would encompass multiple nationalities. Very briefly, how did we collect the data? We mainly ran surveys and interviews. They all had to be online due to, or electronically based, due to COVID, which imposed a lockdown on us at the time when this research was conducted. We were aided in our data collection by a number of NGOs and community organizations who already had access to networks of workers and migrants, and also by business partners who offered to enable us to reach out to their workers. The data was collected from all around the UK, and of course we targeted particular geographical areas where we knew that there was a high concentration of migrant workers from Romania and Bulgaria. What did we collect? We collected 3 types of data: demographic data, data about their journeys prior to their arrival to the UK, and also data about their working experience in the UK. Due to time constraints, I will only be talking to you today about their experience while working in the UK, but if you are interested to read the full report, I will add a link to that at the end of my presentation. So who did we sample? We sampled 440 Romanian and Bulgarian workers, within which we included a number of Romanian Roma, and we also interviewed a number of workers, but also various other stakeholders who enabled us to build a holistic picture about their working experiences in the UK. Most of the people we spoke to were working in the food industry. 19% were employed in the agricultural industry, and 19% in other industries such as constructions, hospitality, cleaning, delivery, and warehouses. So now let's get going and delve straight into some of the findings. One of the key questions that we are really interested in was to look at the experience, at the problems that workers experience at their workplace. So when we raised this question, we are quite pleased to see that a large majority didn't encounter any problems at their workplace. However, we can tell from the bar chart here that a number of people reported various issues. Top among those issues was emotional abuse and threats. 14% reported experiencing such things. 11% reported that they were not issued with payslips. Other things that stood out for us were, for instance, the fact that 10% of the people reported that they were working below the minimum wage. But also 7% reported that their wage was withheld, and a recurrent theme that seems to reappear in the literature is the fact that 7% of the people were not allowed to take holiday, and 7% as well were not receiving holiday pay. When we broke further down this data and we looked at ethnicity, we noticed that the Romanian Roma reported a much higher percentage of issues at the workplace in comparison to non-Romanian Roma. So we can see quite clearly, for instance, that 28% reported emotional abuse as opposed to 11% of non-Romanian Roma. Similarly, it stands out the fact that 32% of Romanian Roma were not issued with a work contract as opposed to only 7% of the non-Romanian Roma. And perhaps the most staggering finding is that 16% of the Romanian Roma experienced or reported experiencing physical abuse as opposed to only 2% of the non-Romanian Roma. This clearly indicates that there is a bigger issue that we need to look into more detail around ethnicity and discrimination. Now that we identified the problems that people experience at the workplace, we wanted to understand whether they were aware of their labor rights. So we asked them to tick whether they were aware of some of the key labor rights in the UK. And you can tell from the bar chart here that most of them were aware of their key rights. However, there is significant room for improvement. For instance, only 64% of those sampled stated that they knew that they should not be charged for training or equipment received at the workplace. Only 66% knew that they were entitled to statutory sick pay. And perhaps even more surprisingly, only 78% knew that they were entitled to at least minimum wage. Empowering workers through knowledge, therefore, remains one of the key things that we need to work further on. Now that we looked at workers' knowledge of their labor rights, we wanted to understand the reasons for which they may not be acting if they encountered a problem at the workplace. The findings show that the main reported barrier to reporting labor exploitation is the lack of English proficiency. 41% of the sample were not confident or had not achieved the necessary language skills to be able to report an issue. However, this is an interesting point because based on the data collected from the interviews, we found that it's more likely to be the intersection between the lack of English proficiency and the lack of alternative jobs that people can move in that acts as a barrier rather than language proficiency alone. For example, we spoke to large companies in the agri-food industry who told us that they have set up hotlines in workers' own home languages where they can call to raise an issue. So it's a mechanism for complaints, right? However, these lines are rarely used by workers, which kind of indicates that they are reluctant to report regardless of whether they have the language ability to do so or not. What came more often out from the interviews that we carried out, both with workers and NGOs, was the lack of alternative employment because they lacked certain skills to progress into higher up, better paid jobs, and they lacked the language skills to enter a different job market as well. And this is to some extent reflected in the second answer that people provided. 28% of them were worried that they would be losing their job. Thirdly, people raised the fact that they were unsure where and with whom to raise the issue encountered. And this links in nicely with the previous slide, indicating that it's not sufficient only to know your rights, but you need to know how to use the knowledge acquired to be able to defend that labor right. And a last point that I would like to highlight from this graph is that 20% of the sample which raised the fact that regardless of the problem, I just want to get paid. In other words, people are very focused on short-term goals and usually on financial gains, particularly migrant seasonal workers. And here I have added a couple of quotes from some of the respondents that we spoke to who explained in their own words the reasons for not acting. Some said, I reported some issues that were not fair and they started bullying other colleagues who were in my network. Another respondent stated that while working on a farm and when they tried to raise an issue, they were left by the company in the caravans and they did not call them to work. And I should highlight that in the UK, it is very common in the agricultural sector to be paid by piece rate. That means that you only get paid per the number of kilos of fruit or vegetables collected, let's say, or number of trays of strawberries that you pick up in a day, for instance. So not being asked to work means that you don't get paid. The recruitment agency office, the respondent continued, that supervised our stay on the farm specified that they would deal with the problem, but in fact, no analysis of the situation was carried out. The manager who was assigned to the farm from time to time threatened to fire us. And the third respondent provides a completely different perspective. I prefer to listen and do what I must to do. And as long as I do my job, I have nothing to worry about. Following up from the topic of knowledge of right and raising an issue, we wanted to also assess the extent to which people are confident in completing certain tasks which may enable them to raise an issue. This is inspired by Porter's subjective legal empowerment theory. So we asked respondents whether they would be confident to contact the police, contact the labor inspectorate, involve a third party like a union or NGO, talking to an employer or gathering information. And as you can see, most reported that they would have some degree of confidence in undertaking some of these tasks. However, there is a significant percentage of people ranging from 16% to 27% who were not as confident in undertaking any of these tasks. And moving on to the last finding, which speaks to the main question that we raised: what impact has the COVID pandemic had on workers' working conditions, health, and income? As we expected, for most of them, COVID meant a reduction in the working hours. This also impacted, of course, their finances. So 25% reported that they struggled to pay rent. 18% reported that they had to borrow money from friends or from the bank. 4% also reported that they had to borrow money from people they didn't know well. And we also know that most Romanians and Bulgarians, when they come to the UK and embark on this migration journey, they often have to borrow money from friends and relatives until they get their paychecks. So there is a question here about whether the pandemic has intensified this problem. Other issues reported by 9% of the sample was that they were not allowed to take breaks at work. This is most likely due to the fact that companies furloughed workers and didn't necessarily bring them back quickly enough when the orders started increasing, which means that those who were in the active workforce had to deal with higher targets and pressures to deliver those targets. Therefore, they were less likely to be allowed to take breaks at work. And now I would like to wrap up this presentation by drawing a couple of conclusions and putting forward a few recommendations. Based on our findings, we would first argue that informing people about their labor rights is important, but it is not sufficient. People need to know how to access help, how to navigate the labor system in order to be able to enforce their rights. Secondly, workers reported language to be a key barrier in reporting labor irregularities, but it is more likely to be the intersection between language and other factors, such as the lack of alternative employment opportunities, the lack of knowledge about the labor system, lack of knowledge about their labor rights, which act as a real barrier to reporting irregularities. Thirdly, we will strongly encourage companies to conduct training in the home languages of the workforce and also to ensure that work contracts are translated. This is in order to ensure that workers are kept safe at the workplace and also that they are knowledgeable about their rights. We have also come across a high degree of misinformation within the communities of migrant workers. These communities often rely on online information, which sometimes is inaccurate. And so we'd like to see a higher presence of community organizations who can act as advocates and advisors, especially for the newly arrived populations of migrant workers. Ideally, we would also like to see a much better funded GLAA, which at the moment only has 13 labor inspectors to cover the entire country. And lastly, we do believe that unions have a bigger role to play, and we would certainly like to see unions developing programs that support migrant and seasonal workers. Although we know that they are the most difficult to engage, they also risk being the most vulnerable on the labor market. And with this being said, I would just like to kindly redirect you to the Rights Lab website. If you are interested, of course, in knowing more about the report, you can read the full report on our website, and also you can find an animated video which we have recently created, and we envisaged it to be an educational tool for the general public who wants to get a better understanding about labor exploitation, but also for those of you who may be teaching seminars and lectures, and you may find this as a useful tool that can be used as a springboard for further discussions in the classroom. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this. And if you wish to get in touch with comments or questions, I would be more than happy to take them. So please feel free to drop me a line at wana.burku@nottingham.ac.uk. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.